As chair of the Swedish American Historical Society Board of Directors, I want to welcome you to the Society's Fall 2021 program, Historic Sounds from Swedish Chicago, an Immigrant Record Label Revealed. A moderator during the program will keep an eye on the chat for questions that you may have for the presenters throughout the program. So feel free to add questions as they come to you. I'd like to share a poll question to get everyone ready. We're excited to see right now more than 65 people logging in today, supporting the Swedish American Historical Society. People are coming in from across the country and from abroad. Many friends and family in Sweden are logging in. Welcome, everyone. We welcome you to use the chat to introduce yourself and name the organizations that you support in our pursuit to learn more and preserve Swedish American history. I'm going to turn the microphone over to the president of the Swedish American Historical Society, Phil Anderson.
Thank you, Anne, and I add my very warm welcome to everyone who's with us today. We have a great turnout for what is going to be a very interesting and entertaining program. Because of the ongoing pandemic, it's now been 2 years since we've been able to meet together face to face, either as a board of directors or as a society in one of our meetings. So we are thankful for this medium in which we can host a great program, and a medium which also allows us to extend the reach for those who can attend virtually from not only the United States, North America, but Sweden. Some of you may be new to the society or new to one of our meetings, so I'll just provide a little bit of background. The society was formed in October 1948 in Chicago, and it was the outgrowth of the very successful Swedish Pioneer Centennial, which occurred in various places across the United States. And out of that came the dream of forming a new society. Other attempts had been made going back into the 19th century. So by doing the math, you can tell that in 2 years, we will be celebrating our 75th anniversary. We had our board meeting in Chicago a week ago, and we elected new board members, and we did our various committee work, and have also been thinking about plans for the 75th anniversary in 2 years. So look for that. We plan to do a number of things, including a celebration and publications. Some of the benefits of being a member of the Swedish American Historical Society relate directly to our mission. And our mission is basically in 3 areas. The first is publications. We have published the Swedish American Historical Quarterly since 1950. And it comes out 4 times a year. It's perhaps the most visible benefit that you receive on a regular basis. You also receive a newsletter twice a year. We have also published books since 1950, either on our own or collaborating with other presses, like university presses. We've done about 40 books, and out of that has grown a dividend book program. If you are a sustaining member or above, you receive occasional dividend books from the society. And I'm pleased to let you know that the 2021-2022 dividend book, edited by Dag Blanc and Adam Hjorten at Uppsala University, both members of our society and of our board. It's entitled Swedish American Borderlands, New Histories of Transatlantic Relations, published by the University of Minnesota Press, which breaks a lot of exciting new ground in the field of Swedish America and migration and relations. That will be sent to our members the end of January or the beginning of February. And I would encourage you, if you are not a sustaining or above member, to consider that. Receiving dividend books is a great benefit, and it also allows us to continue our work in the field of Swedish American studies. You can find that on our website as a way of upgrading your membership or becoming a membership. The second part of our mission is preservation. Since 1965, the Swedish American Archives of Greater Chicago is housed at Brandell Library on the campus of North Park University. Andy Meyer is our archivist, and if you have research interests in relation to Chicago and surrounding environs, please contact him. You'll also find him on our website. The third area is in programs such as today, which normally occur in the spring and the fall. Through the years, we have had dinners and speakers and workshops, conferences and symposia. And it's too early to say right now what the spring 2022 meeting will be or where it will be. But please look for it. We have a number of ideas that we are working on. And as we monitor over the next few months our emergence from a time of pandemic, we will surely let you know what our plans will be. But finally, a big thank you to all of you for sharing in our mission and life as a society through your interest, as evidenced today, your involvement in our work, and your support through both membership and generous financial gifts. We thank you for that. But now we turn our attention to the program, Historic Sounds from Chicago, an Immigrant Record Label Revealed. We are really pleased to have Dr. Jim Leary with us today, Professor Emeritus of Folklore and Scandinavian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a program that will be moderated by his colleague, Dr. Marcus Cederstrom, who is a board member and is the community curator and a lecturer at the University of Wisconsin. So thank you again, and I'll turn it over to Marcus.
Thanks, Phil. Super excited to see so many people here. Super excited to be here with Jim, of course. But I like to start these kind of online programs out by asking everyone to take a moment to think about place. I work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which lies on Ho-Chunk land. And I mentioned that to acknowledge where we are, but also to acknowledge that we cannot tell the story of immigration, of history, of heritage, of family and friends without understanding where we came from, where we are, who came before us, and who will remain after us. So I ask everyone to take a moment to think about the people who were in the place you currently live. Think about those who are kin to you and those who aren't. How the land and the plants and the animals have changed, but also remain the same, and how we relate to that land. All of these connections, they help shape who we are, and they help shape the place we live in today. So I think it's important to kind of embrace that, to reflect on that for a moment as we introduce Dr. James Leary here, whose work has long engaged with the people and the places and the environment that make up and define our everyday lives. So I think this is a great opportunity to kind of take that time. As Phil mentioned, Jim is Emeritus Professor of Folklore and Scandinavian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He co-founded the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures. He's a two-time Grammy nominee for Best Album Notes, which is super cool. And his research on folk narrative song, music of indigenous, immigrant, and working class peoples has resulted in a ton of media productions and publications like So Oli Says Delina, Folk Humor of the Upper Midwest, as well as, and this was nominated for a Grammy, Folk Songs of Another America, Field Recordings from the Upper Midwest, 1937 to 1946. So he's the author of the album notes and the researcher behind the work for Swede Home Chicago, the vaudevillians Svenska record story, 1923 to 1927, which we're going to hear more about today. He's also the only person I know to have worn a World's Most Dangerous Polka Band hat to the Grammys. So with that, I want to go ahead and welcome Jim, and I'll hand it over to him right now to take it away.
I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. And in addition to thanking Marcus, I'd like to thank Phil Anderson and also Ann Jenner for their preliminary remarks. And Ann did a great job helping us go through a rehearsal on Friday. So I'm hoping everything will be smooth today. It's a thrill to see so many people in attendance, and there are some of you who I'll be recognizing because a production like this is very much a collaborative effort. This is a reissue of sound recordings that were originally made in Chicago, featuring Swedish performers from that city, as well as people touring through there that offer a cross-section of the kind of music that was happening in Swedish American communities in the early 20th century. And the, let's see, do I need to do something to advance my, there we go, okay. This production was issued on the Archeophone label, which was founded by Rich Martin and Megan Hennessy, who are in attendance. And they have specialized in making available beautifully restored and annotated and contextualized reissues of early sound recordings extending from the late 19th century into roughly the mid 1920s, looking at the acoustic era of sound recording before electrical recording came in the mid 1920s. And this particular production, as we'll see, kind of straddles those bounds. Here it is in all of its glory, in addition to being superb scholars and masters of recording, finding it, and restoring historic sound recordings. Rich Martin and Megan Hennessy also excel in design, and this is a beautifully designed 2 CD set with a 76-page illustrated booklet. Wallin Svenska Records is not something that I had planned to investigate, but it did come out of ongoing work that I've done. I was born and raised in northern Wisconsin, in a farming and logging town, Rice Lake, Wisconsin, indigenous land, Anishinaabe or Ojibwe land, but also the place where many people, different parts of Europe came. Can you hear me all right? There was some, well, at any rate, I grew up hearing all kinds of different sounds from the dialect of many neighbors, grandparents of some of my friends who were either indigenous, French Indian, or had come from other countries, including many of the Nordic countries. And so I remember as early as I was born in 1950, around 1954, 55, hearing Scandinavian dialect jokes, which were exciting to me. And some of my earlier work, Marcus mentioned, So Oli Says to Lena, looks at folk humor. These are field recordings that I and others made and transcribed and annotated, having to do with the diverse joke telling and humorous anecdote telling of people in the upper Midwest. And I've also had a long-standing interest in dialect songs, including the Swede from North Dakota. I just published a a long piece and came pretty close, I think, to finding out the origins and certainly the patterns of circulation. And here I'll give a shout out to and Charlotte Harvey, who I see is in attendance and whose pioneering work on Scandinavian entertainers, especially Swedish entertainers in America, has been pioneering and inspiring. And Landis Magnusson, I see, is also in attendance, and he's done great work as well. In the late 1970s, I began to make field recordings and oral histories with diverse musicians, folk and kind of roots musicians in the upper Midwest. And not surprisingly, these included Swedes. In 80-81, I recorded Fritz Swanson, who ran a working class tavern in southern Ashland County in northern Wisconsin, played a lot of dance music, including tunes by Ole Skratold. And just across the lake were people who never entered his tavern, those who were active, Pastor Ray Larson and his wife and daughter, who were active in a Swedish Baptist church, and they had a string band featuring violin or fiddle, Hawaiian lap steel guitar, different auto harps, vibraphones, guitars, and I'm sitting here making a field recording of them in their church in 1981. I also became very interested in the field recordings that were made earlier on in the upper Midwest as a region. And from 1937 to 1946, a number of field workers, including the famous Alan Lomax, made field recordings in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. They recorded about 2,000 tunes in more than 25 languages. And except for the English language recordings, these had been chiefly buried. They had not been released. It was too challenging for anyone to kind of put out all of these, but by the second decade of the 21st century, I was able to share digital files with people who had great language skills, and we were able to do transcriptions and translations of lyrics in all 25 of these languages, and I was able to find out background information. And of course, Swedes were numbered among these performers, including the sisters Ruth Olsen and Alice Carlson from Grantsburg, in that one of these historic Swedish communities on the Wisconsin side of the St. Croix River. There were also bands like just above the title of Folk Songs of Another America, the Wisconsin Lumberjack Band that played tunes like Kvasser Waltz, which was circulating in the lumber camps of northern Wisconsin and Minnesota. In the course of doing field research with performers in the upper Midwest, I learned about people who had influenced them. In some cases, touring performers who'd come through the area. In other cases, sound recordings that they were able to purchase in the 1920s. And these included people like the bone comic performer, Yalmer Peterson from Värmland, who called himself Ole Skratold, Ole from Laughtersville. He actually had a brother who lived in Grantsburg, where the two sisters in the previous image were shown. But he barnstormed from a base in Minnesota and later in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, all across Swedish America, often with a troupe of performers from widely different areas. Here is a poster of him performing in Seattle, Washington, with a large troupe of performers, including an accordionist, Alfred Edstrom, who would record with other people on the Wallin's label. And down here, Harry Swanson, a great multi-instrumentalist who played piano as well as violin, and he was from the Swedish community in Jamestown, New York. Another performer who was well known to some of the people I was interviewing was the sunshine singer Johannes Holtmann, who was active in the Covenant Church. He was based in Chicago for a while and eventually was in Worcester, Massachusetts, and made many sound recordings that circulated. This photograph, actually, one of my students found in Stockholm, Wisconsin, in an antique store, and brought it to me, and we were able to add it to our archival collection at the University of Wisconsin. I also became aware through doing fieldwork of the many so-called foreign series and imported 78, early shellac discs that were circulating and widely appreciated in immigrant communities, including Swedish immigrant communities. Here's a newspaper ad from Worcester, Massachusetts, for cylinder recordings, actually on the Edison label. And here are some Columbia records, Swedish records advertised by a Minneapolis store. At the University of Wisconsin, we're very fortunate to have an excellent music library that has been open to specializing in the music of diverse peoples in the upper Midwest, both field recordings, home recordings made by musicians who may have bought a real tape recorder in the 50s, and also historic commercially issued sound recordings. And a number of years ago, through a joint venture of the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures at the University of Wisconsin and our Mills Music Library, we got funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities to launch a project, Local Centers, Global Sounds, Historic Recordings, and Midwest Musical Vernaculars, where we've been able to put online thousands of historic field recordings, commercial recordings, photographs, field notes, and other kinds of materials, and not only make them accessible for streaming, but they're available for free download. And I'll mention that Marcus has a list of various links that go along with some of the
Okay, so I'll listen to this while I.
parts of the performance, and he'll be putting them up as we go along. As I mentioned, these collections at University of Wisconsin have commercial sound recordings, and here's the home page for this little sub collection. A Swiss group that toured a lot in the Midwest. Some recordings made on a Milwaukee label by some Polish performers, and then Wallin's a Svenska record, a performance by the tenor singer Henry Corcell that we'll learn a little more about. Now, because of my interest in musical diversity in the upper Midwest, and because I had worked on this earlier Folk Songs of Another America, I fell in with Rich Martin and Megan Hennessy of Archeophone, and they suggested we work on a project together. The first one had to do with an immigrant label founded by a Swiss person who came to Monroe, Wisconsin, and we found all the records on that label and did a 2 CD reissue. And that involved a lot of kind of not only relying on what we had at the University of Wisconsin's music library, but reaching out to other institutions and especially to collectors. And we were fortunate through Rich and Megan's network to be in touch with Bob Kuhn of Menasha, who I'm pleased to see, along with Rich and Megan, are here on this event. And Rich and Megan brought up their portable equipment to clean and make digital transfers of these records. But in the course of being there, we found out that Bob had some records that he'd be willing to part with for the University of Wisconsin, and those included some records on the Wallin's Svenska Records label, which we subsequently purchased. And right about that time, Marcus was hired along with several other colleagues as part of sustaining Scandinavian folk music in the folklore in the upper Midwest, or Nordic Folklife initiative. And we also had some funds left over from the National Endowment for the Humanities grant. And we were able to put some of those efforts into working with Archeophone to try to work on a Wallin's Svenska Records reissue. We had about half of the records we needed or knew about in the Mills Music Library, University of Wisconsin collection. So we began to get in touch with other organizations. One of them was the Scandinavian American Recordings collection at Gustavus Adolphus, which is a fantastic resource. They've put online sound recordings as well as some discographic information on Scandinavian American records. And through Marcus's good relationships with them, they kindly let us borrow a couple of records so we could clean them up and make digital transfers. On that note, I'll mention briefly that at the beginning of the program, you heard some of the restored sound from this project. You'll hear some more as we go along. And all of this was the result of the brilliant and painstaking work of the audio engineer and our Archeophone co-owner, Rich Martin. And if any of you have questions in the Q&A about the challenges of restoring old sound recordings, Rich, I'm thinking would be happy to enlighten you. But to get back to the source of these recordings, we found 5 more that we hadn't found anywhere else from the Swedish American Museum. They also were very kind, let us take the recordings to Rich and Megan in their home in the Champaign-Urbana area, where they were cleaned up, and then Marcus returned them. We also found there flyers, handbills, songbooks, some photographs having to do with some of the performers that I'll get to in a minute. And so we're very grateful to Karen Abercrombie and the staff of the Swedish American Museum in advancing this project. We look to Sweden as well, and I'm delighted to see that in the audience is Per Larsson, who has devoted a lot of his interest to Gustav Fernando, an important performer who we'll hear from in a moment. He provided us with digital sound recordings, and we also got some from from Swedish radio, as well as from the Swedish National Library that has this great database, the Svensk Media Database. And here's where a screenshot of where I plugged in Wallins between 1920 and 29. We could find out which records they had. And in a couple of cases, they had records that we had not found elsewhere. So we pulled all of these in, and then we set about trying to find out more about the founder of the record label, Gustav Wallin, and about the performers and about the songs and tunes that were featured. This photograph, unfortunately, we did not discover in time to include in the booklet. This comes from the descendants of the record label's founder's older brother. Gustav Wallin, who founded the label, was preceded to Chicago by his brother Severin Algot Wallin. And we just recently were contacted by the great-granddaughter of Severin, Julie Bromley, who put us also in touch with her brother, Les Olson. And from them, we got this photograph of the childhood home of Gustaf Wallin in the western coast of Sweden, north of Göteborg or Gothenburg. In this rocky area, you can see the rocks rising above the roof, and in the background, this was a place where the Wallin family lived. Gustaf Wallin was born in 1886. He was the 8th of 10 children. He had a number of older brothers, and this was an area of Sweden. There was a herring fishery. There was trade up and down the coast. There were Swedish Navy vessels that patrolled the area, and there was a fisher crofter kind of complex where people would raise a little bit what they could, but you couldn't farm prosperously. People would do day laboring, and then there was a lot of work to be done at sea. Sailors in various capacities, and that's the context where Gustaf Wallin grew up. But for 10 children, you weren't going to live very easily, and of course the economy was changing. Sweden was rapidly industrializing. In his late teens, Gustaf went to Gothenburg. He learned the craft of a woodworker, and by about 1906 or something like that, he was in Stockholm working in a piano factory. There he met a woman named Anna Lindgren, who had also come to the city. She was a seamstress. They were married, they had a small child, and things must not have been going too well for them economically. Gustaf's brother Severin had already come to Chicago, and Gustaf also had friends that he'd worked with in Stockholm in piano factories who had worked in Chicago. So he set out by himself in 1910. His wife and their child Gustaf were left behind, and he wanted to earn some money as quickly as he could. He came to the Lakewood area of Chicago that was a Swedish kind of working class neighborhood with also small shops run by immigrant entrepreneurs. And here we see his certificate of arrival. He arrived in 1910 in Boston, and within a few years, he was able to earn enough to bring over his wife and son. And this is his 1917 draft registration card. And you can see he has a wife and 2 children. His daughter Signe was born soon after. Anna and Gustaf came over, and he had risen from a lower rank to becoming a foreman in the Gulbenson piano company in Chicago. This was a major manufacturer of regular pianos as well as player pianos in the early 20th century. And Gustaf, during his early years, we can see him here. He's this fellow right here in the factory. Gulbenson piano factory. He was doing piecework. He was for 2 cents a piece. He was sanding and polishing the headboards on pianos. And according to his reminiscence, he could earn about $1 a day doing that. Now, I don't know whether he worked 8-hour days or longer days. If it was 8 hours, at any rate, 2 cents a headboard, he'd be doing 50 of them a day. But he had it in the back of his mind. He wanted to be self-employed. He wanted to run a small shop. He was temperate. He was hardworking. He was ambitious and visionary. And thanks to his granddaughter, Carol Dixon, we have this magnificent photograph. We know it's from 1920. He opened his shop in the fall of 1919. We were able to get such a good scan that we could blow this up, and Rich Martin's keen eye found a calendar on here that gave the date of 1920. But you see the interior of a shop with some notable features. There's some Gustaf and his wife Anna are behind the counter. We know from their daughter Signe, who was interviewed for the Vasa archives in Bishop's Hill in the early 90s, that this place was not only a store, but it was a social center, a community center for people who were gathering in that area, or homesick, who appreciated music. And we see a number of dressed up women, probably fall of the year, winter time, seated around a player piano with a bunch of player rolls, I assume, up above. We see this wind-up record player here with cabinet for storing records. We see some elegant lamps. These were a sideline for Gustav Wallin, these kind of parlor lamps with the groovy fringes on them. And he could repair, he was quite adept at repairing musical instruments as well as selling them. Whoops. And so we see instruments in the case, and as well as other recordings. And he advertised quite a bit in the various Swedish language newspapers. There were 4 or 5 that he advertised in regularly. At first, with regard to records, he was solely dealing in commercial recordings that came from afar. Columbia records were recorded in the New York City area. Victor records were recorded in Camden, New Jersey. He also had some specialty, carried a specialty line that Pastor Holtmann, whose picture we saw earlier, produced. And then there were imported records on the Pathé and the Odeon label. But in the 1920s, there were several entrepreneurs at work. And Rich Martin knows much more about this than I, but there was a trombone playing evangelist, Homer Rodever, who set up a little studio in Chicago in the early 1920s to make acoustically recorded through a horn, recordings of gospel music, but he also rented out or made available his studio for specialty recordings. And a few years later, an engineer, electrical engineer named Orlando Marsh, set up Marsh Laboratories. He had a small label called Autograph Records that included some Swedish records. And he was pioneering in electrical recording, made with microphones that allowed for a greater sonic range. You could hear instruments better. There's a certain live, vibrant quality to these recordings. And in both cases, recordings recorded at Rodever's acoustic studio, where Wallin's records were initially made, and those made eventually at Orlando Marsh's laboratories could be pressed in Richmond, Indiana, where the Jeanette record company had a pressing plant. So this was an opportunity for a savvy entrepreneur, Gustav Wallin, to expand his business, to kind of diversify. He was peddling instruments, recordings, lamps. When radio came in, he began to sell radio. And he felt that making records, there must have been local demand for records, was something that he could do, especially at a time when most of the recording studios and certainly the Swedish records were all either coming from Sweden or they were coming from New York City. Now, one notable thing about his label was he put the address of his shop on every record. So you see his North Clark Street business address along with his Wallin's Music Company. And he also put in there, not Inc., not incorporated. So he wasn't like Victor or Columbia or Jeanette or some of these other labels trying to establish a label that would then be marketed and distributed nationally. He did advertise in Chicago papers that had a bigger circulation in the upper Midwest, as well as in Minneapolis papers, but that was about it. And he was not really looking to develop a big infrastructure, but actually to augment his shop. One interesting connection that Wallin had was his proximity and friendship with the bookshop, a bookstore run by Captain Anders Lofstrom from Skåne, who had been a Great Lakes captain on Great Lakes vessels and set up a bookstore and a publishing company in Chicago in the early 20th century. And from 1903 to 1931, Lofstrom published an annual Dalkulen songbook with advertisers like Copenhagen Snuff, Snus. And in it were lyrics for songs that were popularly circulating in Sweden and Swedish America. And rather remarkably, Gustav Wallin, probably through printing provided through Lofstrom, began to shroud his records in these beautiful jackets. Here we see a little portrait of Knut Orstrom, but also lyrics for these songs. And I'm not aware of another label that was adding lyrics on their the sleeves for their discs during that period. When we could find these, it was really helpful, especially as you'll hear from Marcus later. The lyrics, if you're hearing them, it's sometimes a challenge to figure out what is being sung. We haven't been able to find all of the sleeves for these records, but we found maybe a dozen or so. Okay, I want to give you a little sense of some of the performers. Many of them were from Chicago and didn't get too much beyond that, but there were also performers who were based in other Swedish American communities who traveled through Chicago. And then there were touring Swedish performers who came through. And all of them collectively represent the range and the milieu of Swedish American music in Chicago and the larger nation at that time in the early 20th century. The first record made on the Wallin label was by someone who started out as a piano player, Harold Anderson. He was the son of immigrants, but in the second decade of the 20th century, Rainer Sundquist and Eric Berg, a couple of hotshot Swedish accordions, came touring through, and they inspired a lot of American performers, including Harold Anderson, and pretty soon he was playing the accordion. He recorded solo pieces. He also recorded with Alfred Edstrom, who's seen in this image with Werner Noreen. they both also perform with Ole Skrattholt, and he made the first recording on the Wallin's label, a song about this is an instrumental version of a song about a kind of a swaggering working class fellow. And it's one that is widely known throughout the upper Midwest. In fact, I worked for a while with a group that that used this tune, but the name of the song was "There Are No Norwegians in Dickeyville," and it's a long story that I won't tell here. But we'll hear a little bit of Harold Anderson's playing, beautifully cleaned up by Rich Martin. Okay, Harold Anderson was a local guy. He was a machinist, but also belonged to the Machinist Union as well as the Musicians Union. Played pretty much in the Chicago area his whole life. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune called him an accordion king in Chicago. But another performer, a prominent performer, who made a couple of recordings for Wallins, but many, many more recordings on Swedish labels and other American labels, was Gustav Fernando. He was actually a trained architect and a practicing architect. He lived in Chicago for a while practicing that trade, but he was also a very accomplished, renowned, and revered cabaret singer who you can see a caricature of him in his elegant evening clothes, but he also specialized in these sailor songs or Showman's Visor. And we'll hear a little bit of one of his classics.
Sitta hemma och ångra dig min docka. Flickor det finns det fullt av i Hamburg och Hull. Ögon det har som eldkål och läpparna det locka. En av dem gick och höstas i sjön för min skull. Unga heta negretter, gula prinsessor, franska komtesser. Armar mjuka som viden, kjolar av tiden, armarna av guller med på den.
Okay, we've heard an accordion dance musician. We've heard a kind of a not too politically correct anymore, racy sailor song from Fernando. There were also classical musicians who performed on the Wallins label, and one of the best, well, I guess the best would be Ebba Fredrickson. She was born in 1901 in Batavia, Illinois. Soon after her family moved to Seattle, but as a young woman and a prodigy on violin, she went to the Bush Conservatory in Chicago and began to play for all sorts of audiences, but especially for the Swedish American audience. In the early 1920s, she accompanied the Swedish American Glee Club on a trip to Sweden, where they were acclaimed. And she also performed on the Chautauqua circuit throughout the United States, but particularly in the Pacific Northwest and in the Western provinces of Canada. We see a poster here from a performance in Eugene, Oregon. And very sadly, she died quite young, She was not even 30 years old. She died of the complications from appendicitis. We'll hear a beautiful excerpt from a waltz. Another notable Wallins performer was the tenor Henry Corcell. He was an immigrant from Gothenburg, worked for a while in steel mill in Youngstown, Ohio, came to Chicago, had various working class jobs, but also became part of a quartet, the Swedish Premier Quartet. They recorded on Wallin's Svenska records, and Corcell also made a number of solo recordings for Wallin's. In the late 20s, he relocated to New York City, and he actually had a couple of Broadway roles in minor roles in the late 1920s. He also performed a lot for Swedish organizations in New York City. He made other recordings on the Columbia label, and he performed over the radio. We're not too sure about other details of his life. We know that his wife died sometime in the mid-1930s. And when I could find him in the 1940 census, he was in prison in Rikers Island. And I have no idea, I have not been able to find out what was happening. But by 1942, he was back in Chicago. And this is his draft registration in 1942. And on those cards, if any of you have looked at them, there's a line where you have to put the name of a person who will always know where you are or how to find you. And he has Gustaf Wallin, North Clark Street, and then he writes friends for 30 years. He was a very gifted singer, and I particularly like this recording of Barndom's Hemmet, which seems to resonate with his life. It's a song that is based on the banks of the Wabash, which was composed by Paul Dresser, the brother of Theodore Dreiser, the novelist. And this song, very soon after its release, was translated into Swedish with slightly different lyrics, but fundamentally it's a meditation, kind of a melancholy meditation on the childhood home left behind that one will never see again. And it was a special song for Swedish Americans, and also quite popular in Sweden as well. We'll hear a little bit of it. And this is Eva Fredrickson on violin as well.
Där som sädesfälten börjar sig för vinden, och där mörkren framtog lyser bakom dem, till den röda lilla stugan in vid grinden, som i forna tider var mitt barndomshem. Det var sol och sommar över gröna hagar, när
Okay, just a little bit more about Gustav Wallin's life. As I said, he was born in 1886, immigrated in 1910, started his business, his record store music store in 1919. He operated it until his death at the age of 82 in 1968. We see a couple of photographs that we were very grateful to get copies of from his granddaughter, Carol Dixon. This is on the, you see the family portrait, Gustaf with his wife, Anna, and their son, Gosta, and daughter, Signe. This is probably around 1917, 18, 19, right, probably a little before or right around the time that he founded his music store, and a later photo of him standing outside the store, which moved to several different locations along North Clark Street. This is probably from the 30s. Things were difficult in the 30s with the Depression. Anna contracted cancer and died. Things were tough. The store was divided, and Signe, whose mother Anna was a seamstress, Signe acquired that gift. She set up a dress shop, and one of her employees was a woman named Edith Engstrom, who was the daughter of Swedish immigrants. And a few years after Gustaf's first wife died, he married Edith, and then they had a child in the 40s, who as a teenager went with her parents then back to Sweden. And we can see Gustaf then, this is from 1958, a return trip from Sweden. These were clippings that Carol Dixon provided us with. We don't know what newspapers they were from, haven't been able to quite pin that down, but there were two stories, and they're quite interesting. One shows the sort of Swedish perspective on America, and they were very excited that that Gustaf had an American Indian, a native person who was a friend named Big Cloud, and I'm not sure who this was. Big Cloud was kind of the stage name of a number of performers who barnstormed around there was like an American Indian jazz band that wore feather bonnets and so forth, and it might have been that Big Cloud who came into the shop. There also are accounts of Pauline's friendship with the most popular Swedish singer of the first half of the 20th century, Jussi Björling, who made many recordings. And then there's a kind of a rags to riches theme in here as well. He's referred to as a fattig torpar pojke, a poor crofter boy who made good in the in the wild west of America. So we see some of these images from late in his life. In giving this account about the record label, I've talked a little bit about the challenges of finding records, touched a little bit on the challenges of restoring the sound that Rich Martin undertook so brilliantly. Then there are the challenges of finding out about the founder of the label, as well as the performers. We had to do a lot of digging. And then there's the challenge of trying to make this material accessible to contemporary audiences, particularly in the United States. And so that means trying to have lyrics in both the original Swedish from the song as well as English. But since there's no existing text for the song, it's an audio text, there were tremendous challenges in that. And so I'm going to kind of conclude my part of the talk and turn it over to Marcus, who took on the noble and daunting task of transcribing and translating the lyrics. Marcus.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I guess it was, when was it, 2018 or so, that Jim came to me and with this idea of tracking down all of Wallin Svenska records. And I foolishly agreed to help him. One of the big challenges, as Jim notes, is that a lot of these songs don't have published lyrics. We were super lucky to find quite a few. We found some of the on the labels there at Swedish American Museum, for example, which was just incredibly helpful. We found a few in the Dalkullan songbook that was published just down the street from Wallin Svenska Records. But the fact remains that this became both a transcription and a translation project for some of these songs. Thanks to Rich and Megan, we were able to improve the quality quite a bit, which made this a little bit easier. I know there's a few people in the audience here who have done this work before. I know Charlotte Harvey has dealt with this a lot, and it's really a challenge. It's an exciting one. It's a fun one, but it's a difficult one. And so what we found, we found a lot of them. I'm super excited that there's so many of these archives that we mentioned that do have the lyrics somewhere. What we found, though, is even when we found the lyrics, that these musicians had made changes. And this isn't super surprising, really. I mean, these are living traditions, were living traditions. Some of them still are living traditions. And so musicians were taking these songs, taking these lyrics and making them their own. So sometimes we'd see just a complete rearrangement of the song. Sometimes they'd cut entire lines. Sometimes they'd cut or rearrange, the different aspects of it. It was really a challenge and a fun one to try to figure out what are we actually listening to, right? We've got a title, we've got a singer. Great. Now what? So I think Jim's going to play up a song here that we're going to listen to. And I think on the album, it's titled Flickan I skogen, The Girl in the Forest. And we'll listen to a few, I don't know, a minute, about 45 seconds of that. And then we'll keep going with this here.
Okay.
När hon kommer är det ljuvligt bra. I skogen var, i gröna skogen var. Vandra i en björketrä och lyssna på. För alla fåglar sina ljuva trillar bra. Och i torneställen var så skön. Gick jag mig till skogens grön. Månen den lyste på vattnet i sjön. Men det var så plötsligt strasslade det. Och fram det kom något som lilla buskar ner. Jag blev dit och rädd så jag kunde dö. Och jag skrek, men då grinade. Sötet och rotet, det har ingen död. Det bara kände ifrån Sundsjö.
So that song appears on Wallin Svenska Records as Flickan I skogen. But as you maybe noticed in that picture, in that last picture there that Jim had up, it's often titled Flickan som gick I gröna skogen, the girl who walked in the green forest. That is much more common it's a much more common title for it, which would have been helpful to know early on, because those lyrics are pretty readily available. But on this next slide, then you'll see what we kind of did with the lyrics, right? We made sure that in the really wonderful liner notes that we've got the Swedish and then a literal translation of that. And we chose to go with the literal translation rather than kind of the more artistic translation, just to give a very basic understanding of the songs for everyone. And also because, as far as I'm concerned, these translations are meant to be edited, fixed, worked with, made your own, for anyone who does want to kind of think through this and sing these songs themselves. So Jim's going to play this again one more time now with this back to back. And hopefully what you'll notice is that it becomes a lot easier, obviously, as you go through this. And when you listen to this, you start to see how you can start piecing together these different songs.
Oh, sorry. God. For some reason it's, there we go. Okay. Here.
Och i torneställen var så skön, gick jag mig till skogens grön. Månen den lyste på vattnet i sjön. Men som det var så plötsligt strasslade det, och fram det kom en stigande till att sjunga ner. Jag blev dit och rädd så jag kunde dö. Och vad jag skrek, men då grenade, menade, sötet och ropet, det har ingen nöd. Det bara kände ifrån Sunne sjö.
So we see this song, right? This is an old folk song from Värmland. It was recorded a few times between kind of 1907 and 1912. Became relatively popular at the time as The Girl Who Walked in the Green Forest, Flickan som gick i gröna skogen. And then we see it pop up in the United States, in Chicago, with Wallin Svenska records. And we chose this song because this is one of those songs that there are other songs that are rough. They're rougher, they're harder, they're more challenging. But this is a fun song, I think, because it is relatively available, but still created all sorts of kind of challenges in the actual research project that Jim was leading here. With that, I think we'll go ahead and move here into some question and answer, but I want to remind everyone, just as Gustav Wallin maybe would have done a while back, that Svenska Records för jul, with the holiday season coming up, folks can pick up this album. There's some really just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful songs on this album. Jim has done a really beautiful job with the liner notes, putting all these things together to give everyone a really great understanding of what's going on. So you get a sense for what Swedish Chicago was like a little bit, right? When Swedish could be heard up and down the neighborhood streets. We get a sense of what this music meant to the immigrant communities. We get a sense too of what this music means today. It's just fantastic to start making these connections with, descendants of Gustav Wallin, who are doing their own research into the genealogy, which I hope many of you are also doing with your own families and your own stories. So with that, I'll go ahead and kind of moderate the question and answer. Go ahead and put your questions in the chat. That's going to be easiest for us, I think. And then I will pass things on to Jim. And we've already got a fantastic question here. Jim, this is from Peggy up at ASI. Can you talk about the community for this music today, how it's evolved? Does it survive in translation? Does it survive in these instrumental tunes?
Yeah, that's a great question and kind of a complicated one. Certainly I'm guessing this is Peggy Korsmo Kennan in American Swedish Institute in Minneapolis, and of course Minneapolis. There's a very vibrant Swedish and larger, pan-Nordic musical scene with some wonderful performers, particularly fiddle players and nyckelharpa players with some of the instrumental tunes, but also people who sing. I see Shara Bostrom is also tuned in, and she's been involved in that scene for many years. And of course, back in the 70s, and Charlotte Harvey was very much part of the Ole Skratel project and the Snus Boulevard Festival that really enlivened the Swedish music scene. And so it's been very much a presence there. Some of the other songs and tunes, have also kind of crept beyond Swedish boundaries into the consciousness of other and repertoires of other performers in the region. And I mentioned that Kvasser Waltz, years ago, I did work for a book that called Polkabilly that focused on a group called the Goose Island Ramblers in Southwest Wisconsin. And one of them was a fellow of Anglo-American background who grew up near Stoughton around a bunch of Norwegians, and he learned fiddle tunes from them, including Kvasser Waltz that had kind of swept across from Sweden, into Norwegian repertoires. And he was playing it on the radio in the 40s, and they asked, well, what's the name of that song? He didn't know the name of it, so he just made up a name, the Dickeyville Waltz. And Dickeyville is a place in southwest Wisconsin. But one of his friends who was Scandinavian said, there are no Norwegians in Dickeyville, they're Germans and Irish and so forth. So they made up new lyrics to the song called No Norwegians in Dickeyville. Meanwhile, where I grew up in Rice Lake, there was a Swiss tavern keeper who played Swiss music, but lumber camp music and Scandinavian music, and he formed a Wisconsin lumberjack dance troupe or music group in the 30s, and they played Kvasser Waltz. So some of these songs have of course, and tunes have died out, but there are ongoing performances, and there are strange twists and turns that have happened.
And I can add to that too. So I was at the 17. Mai, the Norwegian Constitution Day celebration in Stoughton, Wisconsin, this past year, which was kind of still semi COVID-y. But they have the Stoughton Dancers, which is a group of high school students, and they actually danced to the tune for the song we just heard, Flickan I skogen, Flickan som gick I gröna skogen. They do mostly Norwegian tunes, but they also dance to some Swedish tunes and other Scandinavian tunes. So that tune is still being used in that sense, minus then the lyrics, of course. So there is some of these are still actively being played and learned and sung and danced to. Jim, so the title or the subtitle of the album is the Wallin Svenska Record Story 1923 to 1927, and Maria Ehrman then asks why those years for this. I thought maybe you could talk about the record, but also then kind of the acoustic era stuff.
Well, of course, those are the years when the records came out, and we don't really know for sure what prompted Gustav Wallin to start putting out these records, and what convinced him to stop. Maybe they weren't selling enough by 1927. Radio was coming out. Maybe he was looking ahead, didn't want to sink too much into them. When he was interviewed by Swedish newspapers in 1958, he said that it became more difficult to ship out records mail order because insurance rates went up, and if they were broken, then he couldn't afford to put them out. So it may have been just too much of a hassle for someone who was not incorporated. So it was one of these ephemeral moments.
Jim, so and maybe this is a time to drag in Rich and Megan if they'd be willing, but much of what they work on is kind of that acoustic era, right? And the interesting thing about Wallin's is it kind of straddles that era, that 1923 to 1927. It's not a lot of years, but there's a lot of change happening in the music industry. I wonder if you'd be willing to mention that a little bit, and then I don't know, Rich, if you wanna pop in also, we can get you unmuted here.
Yeah, if Rich would like to say something, that'd be great, because
I think we maybe lost.
One.
I think we maybe lost Rich though.
No, we should be here.
There you are. There you are. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for having us here. Marcus, we were thinking about, you mentioned 2018 as the time that Jim first approached you about the project. And I remember it was about this time, wasn't it, Jim? First week of November in 2018, when we went to Madison to have our release event for Alpine Dreaming.
Yes.
And you and Megan and I spent the afternoon driving around and eating liverwurst sandwiches and watching local sports and some of the dives in the back roads. It's fantastic. But you also you scheduled a meeting with Marcus that afternoon. You said, well, we want you to meet this guy Marcus because our next project starts today. And that was this. So we didn't have a moment off, but we did have beer in hand nonetheless. So here it is. What is that? 3 years now? Yeah, took us a while. We were getting slow. Now this had a number of challenges, and things would look so like smooth sailing ahead, and then it would just fall off a cliff, whether it was in the research or in the records or the remastering and personalities and obviously Marcus was pulling his hair, what little hair he has left was lost in the project of trying to understand
all the lyrics,
some of the words.
Yeah.
So you've asked about the difference between acoustic recording and electrical recording, and that is something that is not common knowledge anymore. So we'll give you just a couple of words that maybe people can grab onto and remember. The Archeophone deals with the earliest recordings ever made, mostly in America, but not exclusively. And in fact, the very first recordings were made by a guy in Paris in the 1860s. He wanted to see what sound looked like. He wasn't interested in playing it back, but this was he'd get the sheets of parchment and put them over the lamp and let the soot get all over it, wrap it around a drum, shout into a barrel, which excited a stylist, and it left the impression. And you can see for the first time in the 1860s what sound looked like, the waves scratched into the soot. Move forward into the late 1870s, Thomas Edison invents the tinfoil phonograph. And then in the 1880s, we have the emergence of disc technology from Emil Berliner coming online at the same time that Edison had rejoined the advancement of cylinder audio. Now, what all these have in common is that they are acoustically made recordings. And by acoustic, we mean no electricity is involved whatsoever. What you did was sing or play into a horn like this, which was then attached to a devices that excited a membrane and then scratched the sound waves into a cylinder or disc medium, and all done without any electricity. The frequency response is somewhat more limited. There's not the lows or the highs that we expect to hear today with realistic type recording, but they could be very good, or there can be a great deal of fidelity and warmth notwithstanding. And in 1925, the recording industry almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely switched over to using microphones. And that's the difference. It's the difference between whether you shout into a horn or you gently croon into a microphone. The earliest electrical recordings, though, can be pretty bad. Some people say, "Oh, it's automatically better." Not in the early days. There were some rough spots. The best acoustic recordings of 1923, 4, 5 are often much better than the earliest electrical recordings. Now, the majority of Wallin's output was acoustic, and it looks like. I mean, Jim offered some theories about maybe why he got out of the business, and we still don't know for sure. But it kind of looks like he'd packed up by the time microphones were the thing. And those bell ringer records, the Scandinavian bell ringers, he did 2 discs, 4 sides total, and they're really a vanity product. They've got it's a Wallin's product. It's in his catalog line in the numerical order, but it actually barely has it's the Scandinavian bell ringers that's actually the selling point on the record, not Wallin's. And so we wondered, well, maybe he just did those as a one-off. He was trying to get out, but he did those as a one-off, and they were electric. And then he doesn't do anything for another 2 years, right? He didn't do anything at all in 26, right? And then he has this sort of swan song in 1927 with the tenor Folke Anderson, and they do 4 discs, 8 sides total, and that's it. And those are all electric as well. So the thing about Marsh, one of the most beautiful things on this CD is that, well, first of all, again, let me show you the horn. Now, if you're gonna record, you have to get up real close, put your head in there in order for it to really register. If you're standing back from the horn and you try to sing, the sound waves from your voice going all over the place. It doesn't work very well with large groups. So there were experiments among companies in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, but it was kind of mud when you have a chorus. It can be nice, but it's very indistinct. In 1924, at the what was it called, Marcus? The meeting in Chicago at the Medina, the choir festival.
The American Union of Swedish Singers.
Right.
Yeah.
So with that, they decided to make live recordings. And we don't know how or what exactly, but Marsh apparently came to the Medina Temple in 1924. This is very early for electrical, and recorded this choir of 1,200 voices with some microphones. You can hear people coughing in the audience, and some, there's a few of those. It's unbelievable. The intimacy is remarkable, and I've never heard anything like that that early. And it's haunting, and the voices are just so gorgeous. One side is, correct my pronunciation, Hörsvea, and that's just the chorus. And then the flip side is Du gamla Du fria, which has Henry Corcell in front of the massed choir. It's a real standout. Those two sides are a real standout on the album.
That's awesome. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, and this is what's really interesting about this time period, right? There's so much going on, just in general, and then we've got Wallin's records coming here, and so those two were that Rich just mentioned are very much kind of this like the patriotic songs, right? That Wallin's put out. He put out a ton of different songs, as Jim mentioned. Jim, there's a question here from Anne-Charlotte about kind of connections between Wallin's and the Dalkullen songbook and Uli Skratthult and all of this, and I think is pushing for a longitudinal project here to check out the three of those. But she notes and asks then, do we have the complete list of Wallin's recordings? And we do, we think we do, we're pretty sure we do. But Jim, I'll let you talk a little bit about that search for those.
When we first set out, we did not know for sure how many recordings there were. There are a number of discographies that show Wallin's discs, and actually there's a one thing on the Archeophone site connected with this title is a little blog I wrote about finding the records, and I mentioned these discographic sources, all of which were incomplete, and they would add incrementally one to another, but still none of them were quite complete. And kind of by beating the bushes and putting the word out, we were able to, I think, find out about all of them, because there's a consecutive sequence of the in numbering from what is it, 001 through 28 or something like that, and we have every title accounted for, but there is one disc that we have not been able to find by the in English, I'll say the Berg brothers, and we don't know for sure who they are. There's some evidence that it might be Eric Berg, who toured with Rainer Sundquist and who also made records during that period. But it's a trio. He did have two brothers who were musicians. We have some evidence suggesting one of them might have been in the States, but we haven't been able to verify that. And they toured with a Swedish strongman who called himself Ricardo Nelson, and who would bend horseshoes and rebar and so forth, including with his teeth. And he loved to put on strongman exhibitions and then be accompanied by an accordionist or a couple of accordionists, and then there would be a dance afterwards. He ended up having a travel agency in the Andersonville area of Chicago. So that's one we still hope will turn up, but we do think we found all of them.
Let me just echo that a little bit. For you discographers out there, the first record is 100, and the last that we are aware of is 127. And they, as Jim said, they are all accounted for. So there's 28 total discs. Now on a CD, you shouldn't fit more than about 78 minutes on a disc. We really crammed them, and we got 28 tracks on each of the CDs. You're saying, wait, I thought you only found 27 of the 28. Right. There's 2 extra tracks, and here's what happened. In 2 cases, there may be more. So we can't say that we know everything for sure, but in 2 cases, there were a selection was recorded twice. One of them was the very first record. It's the flip side of the one that Jim played at the beginning. One of our auditors listened to the original and said, the guy doesn't know how to play the accordion. And the second, they did it again. Maybe they felt the same way, that there was problems with it. So it was done again. And apparently this is far more successful of a recording. So that's an interesting problem. Now, if you're familiar with early recording, sometimes a label would put out more than one take of a selection, like early Al Jolson, for instance. Columbia would, you ain't seen nothing yet. The 2 different versions of it were out there at the same time. People didn't care. They weren't as tied to a very specific recording like we are today. In the case of the Wallins, though, these are not different takes. They're actually different, what we call matrices, master numbers, where they were done again later as a different thing. And that happens twice. There could be more out there.
So if anyone's got any Wallins in their attic, let us know. So with that, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're a couple minutes over here. I wanted to do a couple things here as we wrap up. First, I wanted to quickly. We were playing some of the music before everyone jumped on, and as we were letting people in, and I couldn't help but notice that Ann-Charlotte was singing along to Jazzgossen, the jazz boy, which was fantastic to see, because when I was doing all of this with the transcription and the translation, I would harass my dad, who grew up in Sweden, and bug all my friends who speak Swedish, and just bring in as many people as possible to try to figure out, like, what is this one word that I cannot hear? And my dad and I were listening to one of the more challenging songs, an old hymn that turned out had been really rearranged. And he was losing it. He was getting frustrated. And so I played him one of my favorite songs from the album, which was Jazzgossen. And my dad started singing along, which is not a thing that my dad does. And it turns out that this was one of the few songs that he remembers his dad singing when he was younger. And my grandpa was a captain in the Swedish Army. He was a farmer and a captain in the Swedish Army. He was not a singer. And he wasn't singing, in my understanding of him, he wasn't singing this song. But I loved that this song had that connection, right? That these songs from 100 years ago are still bringing people together and still reminding people of the connections we have to our family, to our friends, to our heritage, to Sweden, even, an ocean away and 100 years down the road. So it was wonderful to see Ann-Charlotte singing that. Yeah, do you want to jump in real quick?
I want to jump in real quick and say that Jazzgossen was a breakthrough in Sweden. It was like when Rock Around the Clock hit, you knew there was something new. It was electric, quote unquote. But Jazzgossen is the kind of thing that my father would sing, yes. But I also recognize songs that my mother sang. She was a very great singer. And the one that you played about the girl in the forest, I know something of a later verse, which has Pelle lilla, gör inte så, gör inte så, gör inte så, and so on. And it just pops out of your head. But this is a treasure trove, and I would love to hear more of this stuff because some of it may actually be there residually from my parents' generation. Thank you.
Yes, I love it. I love it. It's a fun song, and it's a fun project. But this is why this stuff matters, right? Like, we've been talking about all these different things. We've been talking about the history of music, the music industry, but there's all these connections that we're making, and why it's so important and fun to see all of you here who are supporting this kind of Swedish American history that we are all living with and working with and a part of. So with that, I wanted to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you for supporting the Swedish American Historical Society. I'll go ahead and put another link in the chat here in just a second, if you can bear with me. Here it is in the chat. Please check out the society. There's fantastic programming that happens usually spring and fall, but we've been moving more towards stuff that happens throughout the year, just kind of speckled in. As Phil mentioned, there's the fantastic publications as well. So a lot going on, a lot to see. Jim and I are happy to answer questions or to take leads if you've got a record somewhere. I'll put our email addresses in the chat as well. And then with that, I want to thank also Rich and Megan for jumping on here, kind of just me throwing you to the dogs, and for everyone for being here. We'll go ahead and play kind of a classic song, I think, here to end our program. It's Hälsa dem där hemma.
Just want to say how awesome it is for us, Megan and I, to work with such pros as Jim and Marcus.
Take it.
It's a love fest here. We had so much fun despite all the challenges of this. The thrilling material, what we were finding, and the pleasure of working with these folks.
Oh, and hats off to Nathan too.
Yes, Nathan Gibson, who did a bunch of the transfers from our music library, and we're so glad. Thanks to the Swedish American Historical Society for having us, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. It's just been.
With that, then, here it is, Hälsa dem där hemma, and I hope that you all do hälsa dem där hemma, and we will see you again next time. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Tamika. Thanks, everyone.